concerns, but it's important first to recognize that we're dealing with a system that's really imperative in order to have a sustainable farming system out there. A lot of the work that we do is based on the campus at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. That's down in Somerset County, Maryland, and there's a picture of where that is just to familiarize yourself. In 1997, that university purchased a former poultry operation. It had about 30 years history of being a commercial poultry farm with intensive litter application. And so the soils on that farm have elevated soil phosphorus content. The Maryland FIV for phosphorus is in the range of 300 to 500, and you'll see plenty of examples of that through today's talk. It's extensively ditched. The soils are poorly drained. Othello and Quindocqua are some of the most prevalent soils that we have in the area, and they also tend to be some of the finer textured soils on the Delmarva Peninsula, and I'll talk about what that means later on. Okay, if you want to put that farm in context, here's a map that comes from Josh McGrath, and it's of the Maryland phosphorus FIV, so fertility index values by county for all of the soils that were included in phosphorus index runs. And so the phosphorus index is run on fields that have soil FIVs of greater than 150. So this is not an average value. This is just of those soils that were included with the phosphorus index. But you know what you see just by looking at the colors is that where the poultry are grown is where you have the highest average concentrations, and that they are in the range 350 to 400 of concentration that we see on the UMES, the University of Maryland Eastern Shore Research Farm. So we've been doing ditch monitoring, and this is what it kind of looks like. We put in a flume really to create a known geometry so that when the water from the ditch runs through it, we can basically measure how much water is going through. And then we have automatic samplers that allow us to sample at various times, particularly when storms occur, so that we can have a sense of what the water quality is and what the loads are. So that's part of what we do for a living. Here's the same aerial photo of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore farm, but this time showing the drainage ditches. They're highlighted. The kind of monitoring we've done is really focused on field ditches. So we have, collection ditches. The PDAs is what a lot of folks refer to them as, the Public Drainage Association ditches. Those are these green ones that I'm highlighting. And indeed, we've got some research on those, but our focus has primarily been on these field ditches. And again, I said that has to do with the bias. I'm a soil scientist. We're really talking about field management. We want to link everything back up to the field. So we've had much more of a focus on field ditches. And these are relatively shallow ditches. That's an important thing to remember. Okay, so the first thing is just to get a sense of the personalities of the various ditches that we have. We have a range of flows. This is just from 2005, just so that you have a sense of how it varies. And what you can see is some of these ditches here, they're labeled ditches 1 through 3. So it's these ditches right here, have higher flows each year than the other ditches. And that's basically just a function of the depth of the ditch. Most of these ditches are about the same length. They're about anywhere from 750 to 1,000 feet long. And so really what affects the flow in here is the depth of the ditch. So with that in mind, you can see the differences in how much water drains out from that flow. Here's what we see when we actually sample the quality of the water and we measure the amount of phosphorus that's in there. You can see that it doesn't really look the same as the flow chart that's up above. In fact, ditch 8, which is this ditch right here, has the highest loads, very, very high loads. This was in 2005, which was not a particularly wet year. It was actually kind of close to the long-term average of around 40 inches of precip. And what you see is that a lot of these ditches that had a lot of flow in them actually didn't have quite as much phosphorus coming out of them that year. The other thing to look at, which I think is important as you try to think about how do we manage things, is that the phosphorus is coming off in both dissolved form and then also sediment-bound form. And this contribution of the sediment-bound phosphorus was quite surprising to us because the landscape is so darn flat. It's very, very hard to see much of a slope. You do get some, bank erosion along drainage ditches, but a lot of that sediment-bound phosphorus turns out seems to be associated with things that are just floating, and so they can be algae that are floating or algae that are actually helping to float sediment that are on the ditch. And so that was quite an eye-opener in terms of our understanding what was going on with water quality and phosphorus losses. Okay, so as a rule of thumb, we're usually looking at about 1 to 2 pounds to the acre of loss being something that represents a fairly clean system, and in this particular system on that year we have some ditches that are much higher. So there's a question from Craig Yoen about the relationship of flow and concentration to these ditches, and in fact if you were to look at a single ditch, those relationships are not that strong. Within events you get certain trends, and so if that's your question, as an event starts, so this is a rainstorm starts, what we see is an increase in concentration and an increase in flow. So an increase of phosphorus concentration, an increase of flow, and then this represents really what we call the activation of various parts of the landscape by the runoff water. And then as the event continues, we see a decline in the concentration, and this is very, very similar to it. So the solution to pollution here isn't dilution actually, because I'm showing loss or loads here. And in fact, the ditch that had the highest concentrations, I'll just about get there, is the ditch that has some of the lowest flows. So this ditch right here, ditch 8 right here, has incredibly high concentration, and you would still get the same load. This is in pounds per acre. It's not a concentration here. It's actually the mass that's coming off per unit area. You would, even if you were to dilute the concentration some out of there, and again, it's because we're talking about the mass. And why is it that we get such a big load that's coming out? Let me see if I can do this. It's actually because we're draining point sources in that area. So the ditches 6 and 7 and 8 all drain areas where there's either poultry barns or a litter storage shed, and they've got a litter storage shed that historically has not been well managed. This is really not what you want to use as an example for how to take advantage of state dollars in constructing a litter storage shed. You can see from the photo that I have here what happens on occasion as litter accumulates, and I should emphasize that this is historically. They've done a lot of work to try to clean this up of late. And so you can see the litter spilling out, and when I walk around the litter storage shed and sample, you're welcome, the Melic-3 phosphorus, which is essentially the Maryland FIV value, is about 3,000. And so I can take poultry litter and extract it with Melic-3 solution. I get around 5,000 to 6,000 parts per million. So this is pretty close to just pure poultry litter that's being leached by the runoff water that goes out the ditch. So here, this is what you might call a low-hanging fruit. I don't think it takes much training to see that this is the type of condition in terms of nutrient management that you want to address. And it does emphasize the need to prioritize. We want to go after our point sources first. So there's that litter storage shed, and it's really the source to ditch 8. Ditch 8 is essentially just runs right off the litter storage shed. So That was, I showed you 2005 data, but now I'm going to show you data over time from 2001 to 2005 from two ditches, ditches 1 and 2, that don't drain any point sources. So there's no flags that would really come up other than the fact that the soil test phosphorus is quite high. For that area, for areas where the P index has been run, a lot of poultry operations, not really terribly out of the ordinary, but you're looking at it, this is roughly an F5E value of 400, 450, so that's a lot of phosphorus in the soil. There are these two of the ditches do have, just by nature of our research, have grass buffers, and those are ditches 1 and 2 that I'm going to talk about. Most of these, and that's only because we installed a grass road that runs around the outside so that we could get to our sampling equipment. If anything, we're showing potential conditions that could be mitigated by a buffer. The remaining ditches do not. So these ditches that you see here, these ditches here, have nothing in the way of a grass buffer that goes around them. So if you look over time at the phosphorus loss, and kilograms per hectare is about the same as pounds per acre, the units that I just showed you, you'll see an incredible range. In 2001, which was a drought year, you can see how low the load was from those ditches, and that's in pounds per acre. And in 2002, 2003, 2004, actually those loads are very, very high. So the loss expressed as a specific yield in pounds per acre, kilograms per hectare, is about 25, which is similar to what we saw out of ditch 8 in 2005. And so this just shows that on some wet years we can get some large loads. So again, on the wet years you might expect things to be diluted. That solution to pollution is dilution, but when you're looking at it in terms of a yield, a specific yield or mass, you actually move a lot more phosphorus off the landscape. And this is, I would say, by any means, an alarming amount of phosphorus to be measured. So that's from the ditches that drain those. We've done a lot of work trying to figure out how the phosphorus gets to the ditch, and we have to document this. We can make assumptions, but we definitely have to document it. So in this photo, you can see some of the monitoring infrastructure that we have. And so I'm going to be talking about results really that have to do with this type of edge of field monitoring. The water then runs through what is essentially a grass filter, and I guess William counsels, that's a great point to bring up, whether we've introduced these grass filters here. So there's filtration of the runoff water, potentially, before it gets to the ditch at the sites that I'm talking about now. And you can see we've got different types of monitors. We're looking at the groundwater, shallow groundwater inside the fields. We're looking at surface runoff, and then also capturing water that's shallow groundwater, but right before it gets into the ditch. And what we concluded over the number of years of monitoring was that more than 90%, usually about 95% of the phosphorus that's coming out the ditch comes out of subsurface flow. So that means it's not coming off of overland flow or surface runoff. Surface runoff accounts for less than 10, usually about 5% of the total amount of phosphorus that leaves the field. And that means that it places the Delmarva in a relatively rare camp. It's by no means unique, but it's one of these regions where the primary concern with regard to soil phosphorus loss or agricultural field phosphorus loss is subsurface drainage. And for those of you who maybe had some classes in the past talking about environmental phosphorus issues, the general rule of thumb historically has been that phosphorus moves in overland flow. Well, here we clearly show that it moves when it leaches, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But again, it's extremely important then, if we're going to manage phosphorus loss from these sites, to try to manage it in subsurface flow, and also explain why the potential removal of, say, sediment-bound phosphorus from overland flow isn't seen on these sites, that we've got a lot coming off subsurface flow. Grass is mowed fairly regularly because we use it as a road, so probably going out there every couple of weeks. Okay, phosphorus leaching is something, like I said, that not a lot of folks in the world had looked at historically, but increasingly you see more and more people studying this. And so I'm going to show you a few photos right there here that come from another ARS researcher from Ohio, where the concern is leaching of phosphorus, but not down to a sandy substrata and then over to a tile drain, but actually, and over to a ditch, but to a tile drain. So what Marty Shipatillo and his colleague Frank Gibbs did was they developed a smoke machine. These are quite affordable units, just a couple $100, that they could put on tile drains and blow smoke back up a tile drain, and they showed where it emerged in a field, flagged it. They found that there was a high correlation between where that was and basically earthworm burrows. Most of this in their sites were earthworm burrows, and then demonstrated that it was an excellent conduit for things that were applied to the field that then came out the tile drain, so things like swine slurry. Here you can see an outlet from the earthworm burrow, and here actually is an image from Finland in which they made a cast of the earthworm burrow, but you can see down in the bottom how it ties to the tile drain. So you can get a lot of stuff basically bypassing, and this is what we call bypass flow, moving through macropores, and those macropores can be earthworm burrows or they can just be very good soil structure. And that's important to think about because a lot of people think, well, phosphorus leaching might only be a concern in sandy soils, but indeed when we look around the world, some of the most acute forms of phosphorus leaching happen in soils that have a lot of clay in them, and that's because they can preserve these types of macropores so well. So I just showed you a little data from Princess Anne, Maryland, and that is about here on the map. I worked with Josh and some other colleagues about a year ago to go out and do a study, basically to see, my interest was to see how unique were the conditions of Princess Anne, but also to look across the peninsula and see if we can get some information to help to feed the new version of the phosphorus index that Josh has been working on. And so we collected soils from up north in Georgetown, Delaware. That was in Evesboro, and that was a fine sand. We collected some sassafras, sandy loams. We have the Quindocqua, which is a silt loam, but it has silty clay loam subsoil. The argillic horizon, the clay horizon that's below the surface, can have greater than 40% clay, and so there's that issue with regard to preserving structure that I was talking about before. And then we went down to Painter, Virginia, and collected some of the Bojack soils that were there. So our idea is we wanted to look at phosphorus leaching from soils. We picked soils only from no-till corn fields, some of which, none of which had received any kind of phosphorus for the last 11 months. We wanted to make sure that either manure or fertilizer wasn't confounding our study. And for each soil, each series here, we picked a low phosphorus and a high phosphorus version. So the low phosphorus version here, you can see for Bojack has a Maryland FIV of about 100, and the high phosphorus has a FIV of about 200. Our idea was to try to get below 150 for low phosphorus soils and above that for high phosphorus. And you can see we have a range. All of these soils were from, had historically received poultry litter, but hadn't received any poultry litter for the last 11 months. So we went out with a big old drop hammer called the Intimidator, and we basically pounded PVC pipe in the soil to take soil columns to look at leaching in the upper several feet. Here you can see the kind of columns that we're pounding into the ground. And this is what they look like after the Intimidator, this drop hammer, has gone by and knocked them into the earth. There's a whole process that's associated with doing this, set of procedures that we've refined over the years, and if folks are interested in research, I'm happy to talk about how it is that we do that so that we really minimize some of the concerns that might come up with bias or introducing something. So we dig them out. Here's the same columns that we're digging out, and then what we do is we basically prep them. So we got this one right here covered with plastic. They're 12 inches internal diameter, 20 inches deep of soil called intact soil. So no mixed soil here. They're intact. We pounded them in. We put a cap on the bottom so that when we go back to the lab and we do leaching studies, the water will run down through the soil, and then we can collect it out the bottom. Okay, so here they are, all those columns back up in State College, Pennsylvania. And what we did is we simulated kind of early spring to early summer conditions. So our idea was to leach these soils for 10 weeks, representing roughly the 1st of February to the middle of April. Then put poultry litter down, about 2 tons to the acre on them. We broadcast it on there, and then leach them again for another 8 weeks. And so that would represent basically the conditions around planting and in the early growing season. We put on the long-term average of water so that you have to develop rationales for all these types of studies. So every week we put on a little less than an inch of rainfall, which was a 30-year average. And then we even made water that we spiked with various salts so that we could simulate the type of rain that is collected regularly by NOAA on Smith Island. And so a lot of effort was made to be sure that the water and that the irrigation regime that we used was somewhat representative of what you guys see out in the field. Okay, here's what happened before litter was applied. So in that 10-week period before litter was applied. This shows the total amount of phosphorus lost in leachate really on a weekly basis, and this is a cumulative loss expressed as pounds per acre. And so each week you can see we're losing more and more and more phosphorus, and that's just because we're adding to what was lost the previous week. Hopefully that's pretty clear. Now I've got each of our soil types here. We have here, this is an Eavesboro high, so this is that high phosphorus Eavesboro soil. Here's a Quindocqua high. And then I've plotted out the averages for all the columns. And what you see, the basic message right here is that all soils are not alike, that we see a real range in terms of their propensity to leach soil phosphorus from them. And in fact, when you do the statistics, you get a clump of soils down here, and then you get a high phosphorus Eavesboro, that's a sandy soil. You get a high phosphorus Quindocqua, that's a very clayey soil. And you get something that really isn't, it's intermediate, but statistically it's no different than all these mostly lower phosphorus soils that include the sassafras and the bojack. So before we put any litter on, you see some significant differences, and they clearly vary across soils. When you group those soils, so you want to do a kind of a inquiry to figure out what really is the control here. And so if you group them as we did like initially into low and high soils, you really see most of the story right here. That the total phosphorus loss that we saw in the leachate, the leaching loss of phosphorus, was really largely a function of how much phosphorus was in the surface soil. So in the surface of that particular column, the low ones lose the least, and the high phosphorus ones lose the most. We then also looked at dividing them on the basis of phosphorus saturation. There's a lot of interest in doing that because EPA has put out a guidance for federal lands in which they would like to see us manage phosphorus on federal lands on the basis of phosphorus saturation. So this is basically a measure of how much phosphorus is in the soil relative to how good the soil is at binding that phosphorus. That's P saturation. It's like a cup, as you fill your cup up with water, it becomes more and more saturated. And so that's kind of what this is, but from a phosphorus standpoint. And you see that, if you take a threshold of 20% for the soils that we had, you put all the soils that had greater than 20% phosphorus saturation and all the soils that had less than 20% phosphorus saturation in their own categories, you see that that actually helps to separate out the differences that we saw in total phosphorus loss. And so this would support using phosphorus saturation or some measure of soil phosphorus as a way to guide whether or not, how we control phosphorus losses from soils. So if you look across all the soils, and this is the average for a particular type of soil, a Bojack low, a Easboro high, that type of thing, and you plot in a 0 to 5 centimeter sample the P saturation of that sample, and you relate it to the concentration of phosphorus that we saw in leachate, what you see is a very interesting relationship. It's the kind of relationship that folks like Josh McGrath and Frank Cole and Tom Sims have seen over the years doing more laboratory types of extraction. This relationship suggests that there might be some kind of a threshold that at some point you get a P saturation level that's so great that suddenly the system becomes very, very leaky. And so we're actually working right now to analyze the data to see statistically can we identify, is the threshold 0.3, 30%, is it 0.25, and we're separating out all these averages on that. But this is, if you think about what the EPA guidance is, their federal land guidance is 0.2, then you would say, well, maybe they're a little conservative, but they're certainly in the ballpark in terms of what a threshold might be for soil phosphorus saturation, at least in terms of describing the leaching potential from soils that haven't received litter. Now, just to your south is North Carolina, and North Carolina has done a lot of work looking at phosphorus loss. They haven't necessarily looked at it the way folks in Maryland and Delaware and we've looked at it. But they actually have you, if you're out in the coastal plain there and you're concerned about phosphorus loss, they have you take about a 30-inch sample. So you have to go down 30 inches and analyze that soil. And so we wanted to see, well, if we took the soil from the bottom of these columns that we had and we related it to phosphorus that we saw in the leachate, is that really a good thing to do, or are we just fine taking a surface sample to describe the leaching loss potential? What you can see here is that, in fact, it's a much poorer representation of the leaching loss potential. You got a couple of points up here that are high, that are these 2 points right there, but everything else is really, really clustered together. And so really, if you're going to go out soil sampling for phosphorus leaching potential, we're not talking about the phosphorus that's down at 30 inches leaching to the groundwater table. We're really talking about phosphorus that's coming from the surface soils that is going to the groundwater. So it's being moved from above and down below. In fact, the concentrations that we see in the ditches, they're the same kind of concentrations that we see supported with this type of mechanism. We don't see concentrations in the ditches that are low enough to correlate with the soil phosphorus concentrations in the fields, if that makes sense to you. Please raise your hand if that did. Okay, so we're saying surface soils really are important in terms of the phosphorus leaching potential from soils that haven't had any fertilizer or manure on them recently. So one thing that you could do, if that's really your concern and you want to kind of wipe out the soil as a source of phosphorus, is you can do deep tillage. Now, you're going to have to kind of turn your heads on their side to read this graph properly, and I apologize for that. But so on this axis right here, on the x-axis, what we have is the depth of soil mixing, and on this axis here we have the phosphorus saturation. What we did is, Josh and others went out and sampled soils. They took a soil sample from 0 to I think this was 2.5 inches. They took another soil sample from 0 to 6 inches. They took a soil sample from 0 to 12 inches and 0 to 8 inches. And each of those samples was supposed to basically simulate like an inversion tillage and thorough mixing of the soil. So you're bringing up material from below that has a higher ability to bind phosphorus than the material that's sitting on the surface. I'm not advocating doing this. We're just looking at what happens if you did some very, very deep tillage to try to lower the soil pH saturation in the soils. And what we saw with a couple of soils, Quindocqua and Sassafras, is that when you simulated tillage this way, the deeper you simulate, the deeper you till, the lower your pH saturation is. So here's something where you're only just scraping the soil, just a very, very light disc, kind of a simulation. You have the highest soil pH saturation, and you can see by the time you get down to about 18 inches, you can take a soil that started with a Maryland FIV of close to 400, 388, had a pH saturation initially of over 50%, and you can drop it down to below 20% if you did a very, very deep tillage. Okay, so that's if you're managing soil phosphorus. So here's going back to our study with the phosphorus leaching, and here's what happens in terms of litter phosphorus as a potential source. So we put on 2 tons the acre poultry litter, and we leached for another 8 weeks. And what you saw is that we had kind of 2 groups of soils. We had the Quindocqua high and the Quindocqua low, that was the fine textured soil, and then we also had the Easboro, the sandy soil, the high P one, that came out and had the highest loads. Then everything else was basically statistically the same. So this is a little different than what we saw before. And in fact, if you average it just on a soil basis and you look just at the averages for the soil, what you see is for soil potential to leach litter applied phosphorus, so this is how leaky is it after you put poultry litter down, the Quindocqua is basically the most susceptible to phosphorus leaching, and the other ones are in a group that's less susceptible. And so that's, again, that fine textured Quindocqua soil has got the greatest potential, and that has to do largely with the well-developed structure and the macropores that are running through it. When you use pH saturation, what you see is the pH saturation made no difference. So what we do is we grouped the soils on the basis of what the phosphorus saturation was of those soils. And really, pH saturation doesn't tell us really anything about the potential of a soil to leach phosphorus that's been applied to it. It tells you something about the potential to leach phosphorus that's already in the soil, but not that's been applied to it. So it means that there are other variables that we have to consider, and it really points to the need for more a holistic type of a perspective when you're looking to manage phosphorus losses, even from Delmarva soils. There's been strong arguments that we could and should just use something like pH saturation to say when is enough, and I think it's research like this and other work that we've done that says, no, we need to look at other variables as well. Here the question is, it looks like the litter application reduced the amount of P leached. We're leaching these, they're good wet soils, and it's a good question. We didn't leach them for quite as long, and in fact I'd have to look to see if that's actually the case. So we leached for 8 weeks afterward instead of 10 weeks, and I've also clustered these a little different, but it's a good question, Craig, and I'd have to look at the data to see if indeed that's the case. Okay, so now we're talking about what is it that we could do to keep phosphorus from leaching when we land apply things. Do we have the same set of options? Do we want to just have people go out there and till everything, or do we have other options? And so we do a lot of work looking at manure application and not just poultry litter application, but also liquid manure applicators. And I've got a unit that came from Bill Dietrich of Dietrich Agriculture from the Midwest, and he invented something that he thought was going to prevent slurry from going down to tile drains, so he thought it would have a phosphorus benefit. So this is just a standard sweep injector that they sell, and what he did was he modified it. He put little wings on it that are like the winglets on an airplane, that stabilize an airplane. Put this little splitter right here to try to distribute the flow, and his idea was he wanted to create kind of a vortex back here that would mix the manure that was being injected into the ground with the slurry that was being put in there, and to plug up macropores. And so here's what his unit looks like when we're running it through Quindocqua soil out in Princess Anne with 8,000 gallons of pig manure going in the ground. Here's what the unit does. It's got an opening coulter that shatters the soil. It's got an arm with a sweep on it right there. It mixes the slurry with the soil, and at least his theory is that it plugs these macropores in the soil. So this is, we decided, well, let's just test this on the coastal plain where phosphorus leaching is a concern and see whether or not plugging macropores actually is something you can do and make sense. So I want to show you some data that came from some trials where we looked at this in the field, and we looked at leachate out in the field. So this is the total phosphorus loss in the field, and we had different treatments. One of them was we didn't put any manure down on the ground. We also took that liquid hog manure, and we disked it in. We broadcast it on the soil, and then we used a disc to kind of disk it into the upper, 3-4 inches. We used those sweeps that I just showed you that were specially designed to try to plug macropores, and then we just broadcast it, which is really what most folks do, just using a splash plate and broadcasting it across the top of this no-till soil that we were working on. The line that I'm showing right here is the amount of phosphorus that was lost when we didn't even put any manure on the soil. And what you can see is that for the treatments where we either disked it in or we broadcast it, we get a little bump in concentration. It's not a statistically significant one for those first few months. What is statistically significant is we got a reduction in the amount of phosphorus that we lost from those anti-leaching sweeps. Now I have to remind you that this is just for the first few months after application. In fact, after about 5-6 months, the differences all disappeared. But this does suggest that at least in the short term, these things are having an impact. Why would you get less phosphorus leaching out the bottom of a soil when you're actually adding phosphorus to it in manure? Well, it's because, let me see if I can get that. It's basically because the hypothesis is that these sweeps were plugging up the soil, and they were preventing soil phosphorus from the surface from leaching down. So we cut off the transfer not just of manure phosphorus, but soil phosphorus. And I've got a cartoon that I hope shows that. So here's a soil profile. This is actually of I think it's a Quindocqua soil. And this is on it showed the approximate concentrations. I've just free-drawn this of malic 3 phosphorus, which is about the Maryland FIV value in the soil. You can see it's highly stratified. It's a no-till soil, so most of it is in the 25 centimeters is about a foot. This is about a foot right here. Most of that phosphorus is at the surface. And the idea is, and this is our acting hypothesis, we haven't proved it yet, but the reason we saw lesser loads with this modified sweep injector is because it's actually cutting off phosphorus at the surface. It's going underground, it's plugging macropores, so it's not just preventing manure phosphorus from leaching down, it's also preventing surface phosphorus from leaching down. So it's an active hypothesis. It's always nice to have something that leaves a little bit of hope, and this is something certainly we're going to explore in the future. So if you're concerned about phosphorus leaching when you apply phosphorus to a soil, it looks like there's the potential to do some things to reduce that. So, like I said, there's some hope for manures. We still got to, take that further and really show that it's a real phenomenon. So far the only thing I've said is, well, we could go out and we could do some deep tillage and we can turn up our soils, and from a soil phosphorus standpoint, that could be a good thing. Is that really what we want to do in ditch drain systems? And I think, most of you guys who are out there working in nutrient management and conservation, soil conservation, would say no. This is something maybe we do in certain situations that are, particularly critical as sources, but not everywhere. But there is this concern that we've got all this phosphorus is already out in the soils, and it's gradually bleeding to, say, the drainage ditches of Maryland, and it's a hard thing to control. And in fact, it's a hard thing to draw down over time. This isn't the kind of issue that we're going to tackle overnight. So I want to use this graph right here, which shows, again, the location, Princess Anne, Maryland. We have a bunch of trials where one of the things that we did is we looked at what happened if you stop applying phosphorus to a soil that started with an approximate Maryland FIV of 450, and you just grow corn and soybeans on it for a decade, and you do not add any phosphorus in starter, in litter, anything to it. You just try to draw it down. And what you see with this graph, so here's time on this axis, and this is the Melic 3 phosphorus value, which is basically the same as the FIV. What you see is that we started off, we got a decline over several years, and this can be interpreted a number of different ways, but this is Melic 3. And in 2007, we realized we were getting real low in terms of our pH. The soils were getting quite acid. In fact, they dropped down to roughly 5. And so we limed them in order to keep them, in the agronomic optimum, around 6.5. And what we did was we converted a whole pool of phosphorus that was in the soil. It wasn't coming out with the soil test, but we brought it out just by liming. So we essentially ended up, just through a common agronomic practice, bringing our soil phosphorus back to where we started a decade before. So I think that the message here probably is less that liming is a bad thing, but it's more that if we want to draw down the phosphorus in our soils, we know we can do that over time if we don't add any phosphorus to it. We can take 25 to 40 pounds the acre phosphorus out every year with a good harvest. This is the kind of thing that's going to take a long, long time to really be effective. It's certainly longer than a decade. We're talking, certainly several decades, 5 decades, maybe more. So we got a long-term issue in terms of trying to draw down these very high phosphorus soils on the Delmarva. The interesting thing was the drainage ditches that were around this particular study, they basically ran constant in terms of the concentration of phosphorus in them. They ran all through the study, even as we dropped down in phosphorus concentration. The concentration hovered between 2 and 3 parts per million, milligrams per liter, which is quite high. That was the dissolved phosphorus. And so, clearly, we're going to have to be looking to some other solutions to address the water quality. Here's how phosphorus moves now. I've given you a bit about the phosphorus leaching issues, about what we saw in the drainage ditches. And here's a cartoon that my colleague Ray Bryant put together that shows basically how we conceive of phosphorus based upon our monitoring out in the field. So you got a stratified soil that, say, has 300 up in the surface horizon, drops down to 10, and then by the time you get down to the sandy substrata, has 5. And if you rain on it, water table comes up. See your highest concentrations of phosphorus and this accounts for at least 90% of the phosphorus in the ditch flow. The highest concentrations are from the surface, and then you have some lesser concentrations that are coming from the subsoil, and then the lowest concentrations are coming from the deeper soil, from the parent material. And so we have a system that's stratified vertically in terms of the environmental losses of phosphorus. Again, 10% or less of the phosphorus is going in overland flow. We really want to address subsurface flow. So Ray's idea is basically to put a curtain around fields that are of particular concern. And so this shows some research that he's done in the last 3 years, really, in which his idea was to dig a trench and to put material in that trench. This is what he calls a curtain right here, that would intercept the water that's leaving a field before it gets in a drainage ditch and would scrub phosphorus out of it. So the concept here is that you have your concentration, you got a rain event, and the highest concentrations come out the surface, moderate concentrations in the middle, lowest in the bottom. That water, before it gets to the ditch, runs through a chemical buffer here, this phosphorus binding curtain, and then ends up in the ditch. He also has a concept of putting a berm in place because you do have fill that comes out of this trench when you dig it. So put it back on top so that you actually force water to infiltrate and not to run off before it goes. So that takes care of that 10% that was originally running off the field by putting a berm. So this is Ray's concept for a gypsum curtain. And gypsum is calcium sulfate. It has in it, like I said, calcium. Calcium is one of the cations, one of the elements that is very, very reactive with phosphorus and that produces an insoluble calcium phosphate. That's the way this thing works. So Ray's looked at all kinds of materials, and other folks have as well, that are cheap, that could be put in this kind of situation. They may not be locally available. In Pennsylvania, he's looked at stuff from mine treatment. There's steel slag that we've looked at even on the Delmarva fly ash. But really what he settled with is FGD gypsum. So that's flue gas desulfurization gypsum, calcium sulfate. It's synthetic gypsum that's produced by coal-burning power plants as part of their effort to scrub sulfur out of their emissions in response to the Clean Air Act. There's a tremendous amount of that is coming in line right now that's being produced. Ray gets his from, it was formerly Constellation Energy in Baltimore. And so that's the material that he's using. And so here's just an image of Ray's experimental curtains going in, his second generation, going in with the backhoe, digging down about 5 feet, backfilling with a modified wet lime applicator that's loaded up with the FGD gypsum, tamping it down, creating a bit of a berm right there. And then this is what his experimental site looks like. It's just bristling with PVC. These are all wells for monitoring water quality going into the curtain and water quality coming out. And this is the curtain itself. So he gave me some data from Hurricane Irene, which he said were pretty representative of how the curtain's performing. And I'll tell you, it's performing extremely well. So let me just see if his curtain, okay, here we go. So in Hurricane Irene, that was the hurricane that kind of petered out over the Delmarva, but it left a tremendous amount of precip. So we got a lot of runoff from there. The concentrations he saw at the surface were a little bit dilute, but there's a lot of water movement. There's about 1.9, 0.3 milligrams per liter, 0.1 right here. But when they came out on the other side, they were, at least at the upper areas, much, much lower. And in fact, he showed that with the curtain, he had greater than 90% phosphorus removal efficiency. So really, really tremendous potential to remove phosphorus. So he has a project right now. It's a Conservation Innovation Grant funded project that's scaling his curtain concept up to a much larger level. Again, this is the idea here is to trap phosphorus before it leaves the field edge and gets in the drainage ditch. Here's Constellation Energy gypsum being dropped off at a farm not far from Princess Anne. Now just focusing on the surface, making shallow trenches that are just a couple of feet deep. He's working with a contractor. The contractor started with this little hoe right here, but is going to move to a trencher to do the job so he can go faster. And I'm going to conclude with a video that shows basically this. They bought a side shooter applicator that allows very, very easy backfilling of the material. A couple of good questions that are coming on, and I'm glad you asked. Ray envisions these to be about, this is about a 10 years worth of phosphorus sorbing potential in these before you would go back in and you would put more gypsum at the site. So once every 10 years you would put these in. We did a calculation today for the farm. It was about I think an 80-acre farm where he's doing some of his initial experiments, and it came down to about $60 an acre to put these these in to rim the field on various sides wherever there was ditch. And so we estimated on a per acre basis, if you were looking at taking 50 years, say, to draw the soil down, that it costs about $3,000 per acre to isolate a site and then go into, say, a drawdown program that would try to bring down the soil phosphorus as a source. So that's a little more detail than I probably should have offered because it's still very back of the envelope and preliminary. But needless to say that this is very exciting, and this is just one approach. This is just one approach. The gypsum's a neutral salt, so it's not affecting the pH right there. And his concept, the saturated gypsum would, unless you put more gypsum in, could potentially dissolve. And so the idea then is that you would put more gypsum in on about a 10-year basis. You could, in these shallow trenches, also remove it if that was something you want. He's going down a foot to catch the greatest concentrations right there. And so, again, this is just an edge of field type of a thing, and I think that is here are email various contact for myself, Ray Bryant, and Art Allen if you've got any questions. I did want to send you out with a video, technologically savvy, but not my best thing. So what this shows basically is that side shooter in action, and you can see the kind of work that they're doing. This is really their first effort to try to scale up the curtain concept, and with that I will close. It's used up about an hour, and I will
We've had some really good questions come in previously. I thought that was a great presentation, and I think there's a lot of things floating around in my head now, especially with regard to maybe liming and the way that it brought up your phosphorus levels. What do you think the implications are of that? Should we be incorporating lime? And what about I think most people apply lime in the fall or now. Does that make that phosphorus more available to run off and to get into the surface ditches? Is there some best management practice that we should be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I showed was changes in solubility with the Melic 3 reagent, and in fact you can see it as well. And I don't want to get kind of too, well, I guess it's a specific question, so I'll go to the specific answer. Phosphorus solubility is at a maximum around a pH of 6.5, and so certainly you can increase the potential for dissolved phosphorus loss by having it at 6.5. That's also where we want to be agronomically, and so I think the emphasis should be less on trying to control soil pH. That's one variable we could use at some sites, but it should be more on trying to draw down the soil phosphorus to concentrations that are at the agronomic optimum, that optimum being 50, not 400. And it is an option, but where we started to see a real drop right there in pH, those weren't pH levels where you're really supporting, like I said, optimum crop growth. And so I think liming is probably something to be aware of for some extremely high phosphorus sites. But overall, I certainly would not want to be making any recommendation for people to go away from the agronomically derived liming regime.
Great, thanks. I see that Keith Hoodnott has a question also.
Yeah, Keith, that's a great question. In fact, there are the work with quote-unquote hyperaccumulators is ongoing. There was a lot of work in the 90s trying to identify them, and in fact, we have some weeds that do a pretty good job of concentrating phosphorus in their tissue, things like chicory. Basically, I think that the rule of thumb is that the greater the yield, the more phosphorus, you're taking off a site. for the time being, you know, just having good yields is a good way to take phosphorus out of the site. A lot of times if we're trying to draw down a site in terms of soil P, our recommendation is to get it in a perennial cover so we minimize erosion, and then to harvest like mad. So you'd be putting it into some type of a hay crop and trying to get as much biomass off the site. So that's less to do with kind of hyper accumulation of, you know, luxury uptake of phosphorus, and more to do with just, again, having a large biomass yield that you're handling.